Syria is an interesting country and an old civilization whose history is as checkered as it is interesting. And the world has now come to know about Syria again following the removal of the Assad regime on the 7th day of December, the year 2024. And in order to understand the history of Syria or the status of Syria as it is important to go back to history a little, but not too deep into history. Syria became prominent in the 1940s, particularly in 1958, I think, when President Gamal Abdel Nasser and the then president of Syria, Shukri al-Quwatli, entered into what was called the United Arab Republic, which was a federation between Egypt and Syria. But within a few years, in 1961, they got out of that particular arrangement, and a series of events started taking place in Syria with coup d'etat after coup d'etat. But the entry of the Assad family, Assad first participates in a coup in the 1960s, 1966, and he becomes a defense minister at that time. And when he becomes the defense minister, Hafez al-Assad, he himself takes power in 1970 via a coup d'etat. And that is the beginning of the personality cult and the Assad regime, which has been in place for nearly 50 years. And what is critical is that Assad, of course, belonged to the Alawite sect of what is sometimes seen as part of the Shia sect. And he becomes very sectionalist in that regard in constituting his government, with the consequence that there are those who are mainstream Muslims who do not, number one, accept that the Alawites are a proper part of the Ummah, and he employs members of his family and remains in power, even in the face of several attempts at removing him from power. And of course, what happens is that he sees himself as an Arab leader of significance. And during the many battles, including the battle in 1973, when he fights with Israel, and that is when the Golan Heights are taken by Israel, which is still in the Israeli hands to date. He then, Assad, enters into a phase of being a pan-Arabist in the sense that he sponsors what are considered to be freedom-fighting organizations or outfits, but which the Western world see as terrorists. His involvement with Hezbollah, his involvement with Hamas. And he remains in power for a long time until he dies, I think, in the year 2000. And that is when his son, Bashar al-Assad, comes to power. One would have imagined that Bashar al-Assad, who is a trained doctor who has been exposed, would behave differently. But Bashar is, in the estimation of quite a number of commentators and historians, worse than the father. He is a continuation of the Assad cult and the Assad regime. And what he does is to continue the factionalism of his father, and of course his dalliance with Iran. Remember, we are operating at a time when there is a bipolar world, and there is the contestation between the Western world, the conceptual West as led by the United States of America, and of course there is the Soviet Union in those earlier days, and of course after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. And Assad naturally allies himself with the Russian Federation and the Iranians, who are then seen to be his underwriters. And Syria literally breaks down. Civil war, factionalism, and Syria is seen as the breeding ground of a number of terrorist organizations on whose forehead the mark of Cain is then placed by the Western world. And During the early days, particularly when the Arab world was boiling, when the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and then it went through to Egypt and so the departure of Hosni Mubarak, even in Syria, there was unrest, but Bashar quells and quashes that unrest violently. It was bloody in Damascus, and he continues to hold on power tentatively with a lot of players. Remember that Syria then becomes the home of quite a number of these organizations, even the Kurds who in Turkey and in Iraq find refuge in that space. So that despite the fact that the Assad regime continues to hold important cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs, there is always insurgency. And I think that what has precipitated the departure of the Assad regime in the manner that it did is that it was rotten. It had started rotting from the days of the Arab Spring. The only thing is that there were so many things happening in the Middle East that it could not be seen. And for a regime that has been in power for 50 years to collapse within 2 weeks of the emergence of the insurgency tells you how rotten it was. Despite the best intentions of the best of his backers, such as Iran and Russia, he literally had to run away. And it is instructive that the reason, in my view, why the Assad regime fell the way it did, it is very reminiscent of all these cultic and these cultic and personality-based regimes. We saw it with Jean-Claude Duvalier in Haiti, Papa Doc and Baby Doc. In North Korea, of course, it has not quite succeeded, but we have seen that whenever leadership is based on personality cult, then it begins to rot from inside. We saw that in Bokassa in Central African Republic, and there's a number of examples of this kind of individuals who destroy their countries. Because if you looked at the Assad regime since the Arab Spring, there was very little economic activity. It was a safe haven for different factions. Hezbollah has major operations in that part of the world, so that the industry that actually kept the regime alive was the war industry. And his departure is one that portends ill, in my view, for that particular region. In the short to medium term, those who have held power may appear to have succeeded, but Syria remains a powder keg. What then is the lesson that can be derived from the Assads? Although I know that history teaches us that it teaches us nothing, because these dictators come and they believe and behave as if their fate will be different. Yet history is consistent that when you get power from the barrel of the gun, you also leave power by the barrel of the gun. So there it is. Assad has sought asylum. Assad stole. He ran both a kleptocratic and plutocratic regime, and is now away in Moscow. And I want to believe that there may very well be attempts by this administration to ask the Moscow government to bring him back to Damascus and to even have him arraigned before the International Criminal Court. I believe that those are possibilities. But let's see how things pan out in the next 1 month. It is a complex situation in that region. In the short to medium term, one may say that there are many interested parties who may appear to be favored. The Israelis may now take the view that with the departure of Assad, then Hezbollah will be weakened to the extent that their presence in Lebanon has also been weakened. It is possible that the Israelis will think that that is a very good development. They will also hold the view that the Iranians have been weakened in that region. They will also hold the view that the Houthis may have been weakened. Because you remember, this Assad regime is the is characterized as the birthist party. And birth in Arabic means resurrection. This was the period when these Arab regimes were emerging. And with their collapse, Iran will also suffer. Remember that that general region is largely Sunni Muslim. And the Shia sect in Iran had a friend in the Assad regime in Syria. So I'm quite certain that the Israelis will be happy. I'm also certain that the administration of President Erdogan in Turkey will be happy. Remember that Syria was the rare ground for the Kurds who sometimes find refuge in that part of the world. I also hold the view that the Americans think that they have an advantage now, that the United States of America must think that this was the regime that was supporting the Russian administration, and that in this regard, they have blooded Russia's nose. So the United States of America, I believe, are very happy in the arrangement. But the question that is fundamental, what will happen to the long-suffering Syrians? Because Syria is a very complex situation. Although preponderantly a Muslim country, there are elements of ethnically based religions like the Alawites and the Druze, and of course the Shia and the Sunni. My fear is that if there is no clear movement and clear attempt at ensuring that all these factions work together for the best interests of Syria, we could very well have ourselves in a situation that leads to what at one time was called Lebanization. And you could have many factions fighting, and those who will appear to hold Syria will be those who appear to hold Damascus only. And people will be doing other things in different parts of Syria. So I hold the view that is a very complex situation. But I have listened to the new leaders. The message that they have sent to the world is this we have done for the sake of Syria. And we want to use this occasion to make sure that the Syrian man and woman in the street, man and woman in the village, does not suffer the atrocities that were visited upon them by the Assad regime. I've heard them say that they are going to work on the economic front, that they are going to ensure that peace becomes a permanent friend of Syria. Easier said than done, because Assad may have gone out, but there are people who may be called Assadists, who may want to ensure that the country does not depart from the Assad philosophy of governance, which, as you know, was personality-based. The faction that actually entered Aleppo and Homs was a splinter group from Al-Qaeda. So that this is Al-Qaeda, but you've got to look at Al-Qaeda from different factions. From the Western perspective, Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, as is ISIS. But from the perspective of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they are fighting to liberate themselves. So in their eyes, they are liberators and freedom fighters. So that the man who is the leader of this particular movement, I think there is a prize on his head from the Western world. And they themselves, I'm sure, they have already placed a prize on the head of Bashar al-Assad. So it's a very interesting situation that one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. So we want to see the West, of course, will find itself in a very interesting situation. Does the United States of America now support these individuals because, or this particular group, because they have removed a leader who was seen to be pandering toward their enemy, to mean Russia and to mean Iran? Or they will give him the benefit of doubt and try to change him or change them, as it were? The jury must remain out. What we must do is to watch space, and I hold the view, and I hope that the Arab League, because Syria was readmitted to the Arab League, that very soon, I hope, there'll be an emergency meeting of the Arab League to look at the status of Syria, because what is critical, in my view, is to stabilize the country, to restore peace, number one. Number two, to get into what I call economic revival. because this country has been under great stress and pain with very minimal economic activity. It's going to be very important that those two things, peace and economic recovery, are given their pride of place as a condition precedent to the restoration of permanent peace, if there is anything like permanent peace at all. The Middle East is a very interesting space. In the short to medium term, it is true that Russia and Iran have lost an important ally. But the parts are always moving in the Middle East. So that it is happening in Syria now. Who knows what will happen in Iraq? Who knows what will happen in Lebanon? Who knows what is going to happen in Yemen? So this is a very dicey environment, an environment in which you can never quite predict what is going to happen. It's possible, and this is pure speculation, that the Russian administration may have a rapprochement with those who have taken power. So one can never, if you want to swim in the ocean of speculation, you must have floaters, and you must be very careful lest you make predictions which do not come to pass. But in the short to medium term, I think that Russia and, of course, Iran have lost an ally in Bashar al-Assad. And I'm quite certain that the Western world are going to do everything in their power to ensure that they fill that space immediately by supporting these individuals. Whoever has a price on his head, I want to believe that every effort will be made to pardon them so that they feel that they have protectors in the United States of America and, of course, the Europeans. You know, when you look at international geostrategic things, you discover that powers are also very clear and very practical. And I think the Assad regime had reached the end of its teeth. It was quite clear that it had rotten, that it was just waiting to fall. And I hold the view, which is supported by the evidence on the ground, that even the soldiers who are defending Bashar al-Assad were tired. The Hezbollah, which also provided them with some kind of protection, have been so thoroughly beaten in Lebanon and in Syria. And you can see the Israelis conduct military operations in Syria, including in Damascus, almost at will. So there comes a time when even when you want to defend a person, the person is so weak that it doesn't make sense. I therefore hold the view that Turkey and Russia must have taken the view that our man is not going anywhere. Let us not waste our effort. Even if we defend him, he's so unpopular, is so vulnerable that it doesn't make sense. And that in itself may suggest that there may be subterranean maneuvers at even negotiating with the new administration. If you looked at the speech that was given by this leader, the speech was addressed specifically to Israel and the United States of America, suggesting that there may be some dalliance between this administration and Turkey and even with Russia. One never says never in these international things, particularly when there is geostrategic interests. You know, the Israelis gave to the world something that is called preemptive defense. That if I can imagine that you are going to attack me, I'll attack you in advance so that I stop you from attacking me. And I think they live in a tough neighborhood. The Middle East is a tough neighborhood where there is such bad blood that when you see them behaving in the manner that they do, it's really the environment is hostile. Of course, one of the things that we must always say is that the problems have a long history. I think the creation of Israel in 1948 after the Balfour Declaration in itself was done so very badly that when we go down to history, you must blame the British. It is at that time, I believe, that a Palestinian state ought to have been created. But they did not. And they sowed the seed of discord, of enmity that we see today. And today, Israel is no holds barred. And they see Syria as a fair target because they hold the view that Hezbollah organizes from Syria, and indeed Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all other terror organizations which are anti-Israel. And Hafez al-Assad was himself a rabid anti-Israel and anti-Zionist. And the other thing that must be realized is that the Golan Heights, which the Israelis said that they will never ever give up, is considered by the Syrians to be a very critical part of Syria. And what we have is an armistice, so that there is actually a war going on between Syria and Israel since 1973. The world as we know it, or the world that we have, the narratives are narratives as created by Western media. It is Western media, is the CNN, is the BBC, it is Bloomberg, it is Radio France, it is all these Western media that define what the world is. If they want to make you the enemy of the world, they paint you in that way. If they want to make you a hero, they make you a hero. If they want to make you a villain, they make you a villain. And this is what they have succeeded in doing, particularly as regards Russia. What they do, because they also control many of these media of communication, whether it's the internet or these new media. So that is how they succeed. And many countries are now beginning to realize that if you want to tell your story, you must tell it yourself. The Arabs are doing it through Al Jazeera, they are doing it through Arabiya, and all these other people. So it is incumbent upon other countries to tell their own story. Because if you don't tell your own story, it will be told by others. Is it not said that as long as the hunter writes the story, it is the bravery of the hunter rather than the bravery of the lion that will be talked about? And Russia finds herself in such a situation. And indeed, if you've seen the conflicts that have taken place in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, look at, for example, the United States of America. When you look at her involvement in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all these others, they come out, or they are painted by their media as the good guys who have come to rescue the world. But wherever they live, there is a complete mess. But that story is not told. And right now, even in the Ukraine-Russian war, you see that kind of narrative. They don't tell you that NATO did enter into an agreement with Russia in 1990 that they will not expand. That they don't tell you. They tell you a story that is completely different. So too with all other things related to that region in the Middle East. You know, when I look at Syria and look at our history and look at the manner in which it started, its colonization by France, the numerous coups d'etats, the Hafez, al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, father and son regime, and the very many factions that have emerged over the years, the sectarian groups that have emerged, the Alawite, the Druze, the Shia, the Sunnis, it tells you that it is a powder keg, and that going forward, Syria is going to be a country that will be troubled in the same way that Iraq remains troubled. And remember that all other international players will also be present in Syria. The Europeans will be present in Syria, the Americans will be present in Syria, the Russians will be present in Syria, Turkey will be present in Syria, and of course the Arab countries will be present in Syria, the Israelis will be present in Syria. And when you have such a situation, it tells you only one thing, that confusion is going to exist in Syria, in my view, for the next 25 years. But it can be shortened. If the Syrians were to have an all-Syrian meeting, where all factions are invited and they agree to form an interim government, and once they have formed that interim government, write unto themselves a constitution that is going to depart from the Ba'athist constitution, and they enter into a phase where everybody is involved in governance, then my prediction of 25 years can be shorter and Syria may have peace. But holding all factors constant, based on the evidence that there is on the ground, based on the history, it is not going to be easy. And it's never easy when countries have gone down. You only have to look at Iraq. You only have to look at Somalia. You only have to look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. You only have to look at Yemen. Look at Lebanon. And it tells you it is never easy. Never, ever easy. If I were to give a ranking of who the beneficiaries of the collapse of the Assad regime are, I would say number 1 beneficiary, Israel. Number 2 beneficiary, the United States of America. Number 3 beneficiary, France and Europe. That is the order of their benefit. And of course, that tells you one story, that every one of these parties is going to try and influence the players in that arena. I want to imagine how active Mossad now is in that part of the world. I want to imagine how active the MI6 and is active in that region. I want to imagine how active the CIA is in that region. That is the conceptual West saying, we've got to come in here before the Russians and the Chinese and the Turks come here. Bashar al-Assad has fallen at a time when the United States has gone through an election that has brought in Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump assumes office in the month of January, the year 2025, of course, there may be different approaches. But I've always held the view that in terms of geostrategic interest, one administration of the United States does not differ fundamentally from the other administration of the United States. Of Donald Trump, it can be said on the basis of his first term that he had minimal appetite for NATO. In fact, he was on record as saying that NATO members in Europe should begin to pay their bills. This administration has also been a very interesting administration, the outgoing Joe Biden administration. There are certain decisions that they have made which are very interesting, which one may even argue are designed to muddy the waters for the Trump administration. This one in Syria could be one of them. To simply complicate the environment so that diplomatically it's not going to be easy to resolve the outstanding issue. The other one, of course, we have seen in Ukraine and Russia, where at the tail end of his term is now telling the Kiev government, you can use the weapons that we gave you to strike Russia anywhere in Russia. These, if true, could be very diabolical, but you can never ever exclude the fact that there is an administration which is outgoing in the United States of America which did not expect to lose. I think the victory of Donald Trump is something that surprised the Democrats, and many things are happening which one would have thought a lame duck president would not engage in. But let's see what happens when the Trump administration comes in the month of January, and see how it plays out in the next 4 years. But geostrategically, I believe that America will remain America in wanting to create Pax Americana.